in the humid, cotton-choked heart of Antebellum, Georgia, where fortunes were built on human suffering and reputations were guarded with the ferocity of cornered animals, a strange and silent epidemic began to spread. Between the years 1843 and 1847, a peculiar pattern emerged among the state's wealthiest plantation families. One by one, their daughters began to disappear. These were not violent abductions that made headlines or prompted frantic searches. They were quiet, almost polite vanishings, explained away with practiced ease. One was sent to a finishing school in Europe, another to a convent in Louisiana, a third was said to have been swept off her feet by a distant cousin from Virginia, married in a swift, private ceremony. The explanations were always plausible, delivered with the unshakable confidence of the Southern aristocracy. And society, respecting the privacy of its elite, asked no further questions. But beneath the veneer of civility and decorum, a far darker story was unfolding. The whispers among the enslaved, the furtive glances exchanged in the kitchens and cotton fields, told a different tale. They spoke of girls who never left, of private treatments for rebellious spirits, and of a cruelty so profound it could only be hidden in plain sight. The polished histories of the Old South don't tell this story. This is the account pieced together from a hidden diary, from suppressed court documents, and from the oral histories of those who were forced to bear witness. It is the story of what truly happened in the hidden barn at the Kellerman estate, and the haunting, unanswered question of why Catherine Kellerman's body was never, ever found. In 1843, rural Georgia ran on a complicated system of carefully maintained appearances and unspoken agreements. The world of the plantation elite was a stage, each family an actor playing their part in a grand, unending performance of grace, piety, and absolute authority. In this place, a family's name was their most important possession, and even a small crack in the facade could bring down the whole dynasty. Power was measured not just in acres of cotton or the number of souls held in bondage, but in the perfection of its bloodline and the impeccable conduct of its women. The Kellerman plantation was in the middle of this golden world, just outside the busy port city of Savannah. It was a sprawling kingdom of 3,200 acres, its fields of Sea Island cotton stretching toward the horizon, shimmering under the oppressive Georgia sun. The great house, a formidable structure of white columns and sprawling verandas, stood as a monument to the family's immense wealth and influence. But ever since her husband died 3 years ago, the plantation had not been run by a patriarch, but by a matriarch whose will was as strong as iron, Margaret Kellerman, the widow. Margaret was a woman sculpted from the very society she dominated. To people who didn't know her, she was the perfect example of Southern grace, calm, kind, and always well-dressed. But to the people who lived in her home, she was a tyrant of perfection. Every aspect of her life, from the alignment of the silverware to the moral purity of her lineage, was subject to her relentless, suffocating control. She was not vain, her obsession with appearance was a religion, and any deviation from its sacred rules was seen as heresy. In the spring of 1843, Margaret Kellerman's Church of Perfection had the most sinful member, her own daughter. Catherine, at 18 years old, was the sole heir to the Kellerman fortune, a position that should have made her the most sought-after belle in the county. But to her mother, Catherine was everything she hated, weak, imperfect, and too quiet and stubborn to change. Catherine was not the fragile porcelain doll her mother wanted her to be. She was flesh and blood, and in the cold, unforgiving world of Margaret Kellerman, that was her biggest sin. This simmering conflict, a private war going on inside the mansion's lavish walls, was about to turn into an act of unimaginable cruelty, fueled by an obsession that would destroy them all. Margaret was very angry about something that was embarrassing for everyone: Catherine's weight. Catherine's mother was offended by her daughter's fuller figure because women were valued for their delicate, almost fragile beauty. It wasn't about health or happiness. It was a clear sign of defiance and a public humiliation that Margaret thought her daughter was showing off on purpose. Every whispered comment at social events and every sideways look from the wife of a neighboring planter was like a knife in Margaret's pride. She saw Catherine's body not as a natural form, but as a rebellion against the Kellerman name, a stain upon the family's immaculate reputation. But Catherine's change wasn't just a matter of being young and having fun. The changes started in 1840, when her father died suddenly and mysteriously, leaving her in a deafening silence. William Kellerman had been a kinder person. His quiet kindness had protected his daughter from the strict expectations of his wife. The official cause of his death was a sudden fever, but it left a hole in Catherine's life. She filled it with the small comfort of food, and her body showed how sad she was. Margaret, on the other hand, didn't see any sadness. She only saw weakness. The spidery, exact writing in Margaret's private diary shows what she really wanted. On March 12, 1843, she wrote, "The girl is still an embarrassment. Her appearance is a deliberate act of disobedience. I have talked to Helena Radford about how she treated Emily. The treatment was harsh, but the results are clear. The girl is now obedient, thin, and compliant. A difficult task needs a firm hand. The time for persuasion has passed. It is time for correction." This terrifying entry tells the horrible truth. Margaret's plan was not one of motherly love, but of cold-blooded cruelty. She wanted to change her daughter by making her do hard work, a treatment based on the quiet success stories of other mothers who had dealt with their own rebellious daughters. She had heard the rumors that the Radford girl, who used to read forbidden abolitionist texts with great enthusiasm, had come back from a retreat looking hollow-eyed and broken, as if her spirit had been broken. Margaret didn't see the horror in this. She saw a way to fix the problem with Catherine once and for all. And she had already picked out the tools that would save her daughter. 3 men, who were slaves on the Kellerman estate, would be forced to witness and take part in Catherine's nightmare. Their lives were already limited by the harsh realities of slavery, but they were about to become connected to the private horrors of the great house in a way they could never have imagined. They weren't picked because they were cruel. They were picked because they were close by and had skills that Margaret Kellerman planned to use for her own evil ends. Elijah Morrison was the first. Elijah was 36 years old and had a lot of physical strength and quiet dignity. His hands were calloused and strong from working as a blacksmith on the plantation. He could shape iron that wouldn't bend over the forge, but his mind was even sharper. He was an observer, a man who had kept a silent, internal record of the world's kindnesses and cruelties for his whole life. He saw everything, said little, and remembered everything. Margaret thought he was just being obedient because he was always there for her. The second was Thomas Reed, a 29-year-old man who had a skill that was both a blessing and a curse for an enslaved man in Georgia in the 1840s. He could read and write, which Catherine's father had taught him in secret years before. Thomas was smart and could think quickly. People often asked him to come to the main house to help with letters and ledgers. His ability to read and write was a useful but dangerous secret. He knew how the plantation world worked, with all its complicated webs of power and lies. He also knew that knowledge could be used as a weapon. Isaac Porter was the third and youngest. Isaac was only 15 years old, but he had the wisdom of a man twice his age. He had only been brought to the Kellerman estate 2 years before, after being sold from a sugar plantation in Louisiana that was known for being very violent. He had seen horrible things that had left permanent marks on his watchful, haunted eyes. He was quiet and observant, and he moved through the world with a caution that didn't match his age. He saw things that others didn't, like how a mistress's mood changed and the unspoken tension between the master and the overseer. Margaret would call these 3 men the blacksmith, the scholar, and the survivor, and give them a new, horrible job. They were to be the guards of Catherine's secret prison. They were in charge of her rehabilitation, making sure she did the hard work, and keeping track of her progress. Being forced to be tools of their mistress's cruelty, their own survival was now tied to the planned death of her daughter. What they were about to see would push their humanity to the limit and bring people together in the most unlikely and dangerous of situations. There was a barn on the far eastern edge of the Kellerman property, far away from the neat gardens and busy slave quarters. It wasn't the main barn, which was always busy, but an older, more isolated building that was hidden from the great house by a thick grove of ancient live oaks covered in Spanish moss. It was a place to keep extra tools and old equipment that people had forgotten about. At night, when the trees cast long shadows, it became quiet. Because it was so far away from everything else, it was the perfect place for secret activities. This old building that no one remembered was about to become Catherine Kellerman's world. On the morning of March 19, 1843, the air was thick with humidity, as it always is. Catherine was woken up before the sun had fully risen. They took her out of her luxurious bedroom, down the grand staircase, and out the back of the mansion. She was wearing only a thin cotton nightgown, and her face was pale in the dark before dawn. She didn't look surprised, scared, or even angry. There was only a deep and tired acceptance, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Elijah, Thomas, and Isaac stood by the barn, their faces carefully blank, hiding the fear that was building in their stomachs. Margaret Kellerman stood in front of them with her back straight and her voice sharp and cold like a winter morning. She gave clear instructions like a doctor giving a patient a harsh but necessary medicine. Catherine's day would start when the sun came up and end when it went down. The things she had to do weren't meant to help her get things done. They were meant to punish her. She was going to have to grind corn by hand with a heavy stone quern, a hard, back-breaking job that was usually only for the strongest field hands. She had to move 100-pound bags of feed from one end of the barn to the other over and over again until her muscles hurt. She had to chop wood with a heavy axe until her soft, uncalloused hands bled and blistered. She would eat cornmeal and drink water, which was just enough to keep her going. Elijah was in charge of making sure the work was done. Thomas was in charge of writing down her daily output in a ledger, and Isaac was in charge of getting her food and water. They weren't allowed to talk to her except to give her instructions. They were supposed to be her guards, her bosses, and her tormentors. Margaret's last words, which were meant for her daughter but were really meant for the men, hung in the humid air as she turned to leave. "This is not punishment," she said in a flat voice. "This is purification. We will burn the weakness out of you." The heavy barn doors creaked shut, leaving the inside in a dim, dusty twilight. The world outside, the world of sunshine and people, was gone for Catherine Kellerman. The work had begun. It was not meant to be useful, but to destroy. The barn was full of sounds. The rhythmic, grinding sound of the stone quern turning grain into meal. Catherine's own heavy, ragged breathing as she dragged the heavy sacks across the dusty floor. The sharp, percussive crack of the axe splitting logs. And above it all, the slow, ominous creak of the old timber beams, marking the passage of time in a place that seemed to exist outside of it. The smell of hay, sweat, and a growing sense of hopelessness filled the air. The only light that came in came through the spaces between the wooden slats, making stripes of dust-filled sunlight on the floor. This was a constant reminder of the world she had been sent away from. Every day, Margaret's visits were a form of psychological warfare. The barn door would open at exactly 3 o'clock every afternoon, and she would come out, her dark figure standing out against the bright afternoon sun. She never yelled or hit her daughter. Instead, she would slowly circle Catherine like a farmer checking on his animals, with cold, analytical eyes. She had a small notebook made of leather and a tailor's measuring tape with her. She would tell Catherine to stay still while she took her measurements, her voice a low, critical murmur. Her diary entries from this time are scary because they are so unemotional. April 5th, weight estimated 187 pounds, a reduction of no more than 3 pounds. Face remains bloated, hands are blistered as expected, but her resolve has not yet broken. Treatment progresses as planned. Or, April 12th, she stumbled twice today carrying the feed sacks. Elijah reports she completed the task, albeit slowly. There are shadows under her eyes. This is a positive development. The vanity must be stripped away before the spirit can be reshaped. Margaret was writing down how she was systematically breaking her own child, not with the pain of a mother, but with the pride of a scientist who had done a good job with an experiment. She wanted a specific outcome, an empty obedience, a surrender of both body and spirit. But something unexpected was coming out of the ordeal that Margaret hadn't planned for in her cold calculations. Catherine's silence. She did the work without complaining. She didn't cry during the weigh-ins and measurements. Margaret wanted her to be broken and submissive, but she was quiet and strong. It was a different kind of strength, a passive resistance that started to bother her mother. Catherine's body was getting weaker, but her spirit, which refused to break, had a strange and strong power that Margaret didn't know how to get rid of yet. The barn that Margaret Kellerman owned wasn't just a private torture chamber. It was a showpiece, a model of how to control people in a horrible way at home. Not long after the treatment started, other wealthy women from the area started to visit, coming in their fancy carriages as if they were just stopping by to say hello. They would sit on the porch and have tea with Margaret, talking about the usual small talk. Then, when they were done, Margaret would take her most trusted guests on a quiet private tour of the eastern barn. There, she would show off how well her daughter was doing and talk in low, private tones about how well her methods were working. These women were not new to the idea. They were a group of strong-willed matriarchs who were all obsessed with keeping their families pure and powerful. There was Mrs. Helena Radford, the same woman who had punished her daughter Emily for reading books that were against slavery. There was Mrs. Constance Brighton, whose daughter Charlotte had the nerve to turn down 2 good marriage proposals in favor of studying law books from her father's library. Mrs. Victoria Ashford was there too. Her daughter, also named Victoria, had done the worst thing possible. She had been caught teaching enslaved kids the basics of the alphabet. Each of these mothers thought that what happened to Catherine could help them deal with their own problems at home. The barn that Margaret built became a model. By the end of April 1843, a quiet, secret network had formed. 3 counties in Georgia now had similar barns that had been turned into places for the same terrible things. It was a conspiracy of silence, an unspoken agreement among the powerful to deal with their troublesome daughters in a way that didn't leave any evidence. Young Isaac Porter was the only one who saw the scary pattern. He often had to go back and forth between the Kellerman estate and nearby plantations to deliver supplies or messages. That's when he started to see the signs. He noticed that Mrs. Brighton would now look away when asked about her once lively daughter. He saw that the barn on the Ashford property that had been used before was now eerily empty. He heard the same empty excuses over and over again, from one big house to the next, a sudden illness, a trip abroad, or a quick marriage. To the rest of the world, these were just random events. But to Isaac, who had learned how to stay alive by paying attention to what people didn't say, the pattern was clear and scary. The daughters of Georgia were disappearing, not into thin air, but into the dark, cramped spaces of barns that were just out of sight. Inside the Kellerman barn, where Margaret couldn't see them, things started to change in a big way. In the shared space of their grim duty, the strict order of mistress, prisoner, and slave started to break down. Catherine was no longer Miss Kellerman, the plantation lady's daughter. She had lost her nice clothes, her status, and her name. She was just a woman going through something unimaginable, and as she suffered, the 3 men who were supposed to guard her began to see her not as an oppressor, but as a fellow captive. They talked to each other with small, secret acts of kindness and gestures that weren't spoken. When Catherine's arms shook from lifting the heavy grain sacks, Elijah the blacksmith would stand in front of Margaret so she could see him. This would give Catherine a short break and let her rest for a moment. He taught her how to use her body's leverage to lift things and how to swing the axe without wasting energy. These were small lessons in survival that he hid behind his back. Thomas the scholar would leave a clean rag soaked in cool water near the woodpile as a silent gift for her hands that were bleeding and blistered. And Isaac, the watchful boy, once caught her just as her knees gave way from exhaustion. He steadied her for a second before anyone could see, his young face a mask of stoicism that couldn't quite hide the empathy in his eyes. For weeks they only spoke when they had to, but the silence was full of a growing, unspoken understanding. They were all in jail because of Margaret Kellerman's will, but they were all in different cells. In early May, they finally said real words to each other. Catherine had been grinding corn for hours, and her movements were slow and robotic. Elijah was standing nearby, sharpening a tool, or so it seemed. "Do you hate me?" Catherine asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. It was so quiet that it almost got lost in the sound of the grinding stone. The question hung in the dusty air. It was a question about more than just this barn and this punishment. It was a question about the whole cruel system that kept them apart.
Elijah didn't look at her. His voice was calm and low as he worked. He said, "Hate takes energy. Energy is better spent on surviving." This was not an answer of forgiveness or friendship. It was a deep, practical truth that showed they were both in the same situation. But at that moment, something changed in Catherine. For the first time in her life, people saw her as a person trying to stay alive, not as a Kellerman or a symbol of wealth and oppression. Elijah's words didn't make her feel better. They were a key that opened a door inside her that she thought had been locked forever. Through that door, a dangerous, unexpected connection began to form. The first bond, which was based on a shared need to stay alive, started to grow into something more complicated, more personal, and much more dangerous. The whispered breaks from work got longer, and the talks got bolder. When they thought no one was watching, they shared parts of their lives with each other, building a fragile bridge across the huge gap of race and class that was meant to keep them apart forever. Catherine learned about Elijah's life in the quarters, which was full of love and community, unlike her own life, which was full of empty luxury. She found out that he had a wife named Sarah and a 6-year-old daughter named Little Martha. Her laughter was the only thing that made the world bearable for him. He talked about them with a quiet, painful love that made Catherine feel things that no smooth-talking suitor's compliment ever had. Elijah learned about Catherine's gilded cage in return. She talked about the never-ending rules of etiquette, her mother's constant, harsh criticism, and how lonely life is without real connection. She told him her deepest fears, her voice shaking in the barn's dim light. "She doesn't want to fix me," Catherine said one night, her eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "She wants me to go away, to stop being." Elijah listened, and his presence was a silent testament to her truth. He didn't offer any false comfort, just the deep respect of being there. In late June, the emotional connection found its physical counterpart. The barn had become a hot oven because of the summer heat. Catherine was carrying a sack of corn when she suddenly felt dizzy. She had been working all day on a small meal, which made her weak. Her eyesight got blurry, and her legs gave out. Elijah moved so quickly that she couldn't see him, and he caught her in his strong arms before she hit the hard-packed ground. He held her for a moment, with his hand steady on her back and her head resting on his chest. At that moment, the world outside the barn, the world of masters and slaves, of black and white, and of lines that were off-limits and meant death if crossed, did not exist. Only two people were caught in a moment of shared, fragile humanity. He helped her stand up when she got her strength back, but for a long second, neither of them moved. It was a truth that was as scary as it was true. The forbidden bond that had formed between them in the depths of their shared suffering could either kill them both, or, just maybe, save them. By the beginning of August, the heat in Georgia was almost as bad as the panic that was growing inside Catherine. For weeks, she had been feeling sick every morning, which she had first blamed on the bad food and hard work. But when her monthly periods didn't come for the second time, a much scarier reality began to set in. She was aware of the changes happening inside her own body. In the barn, where it was too hot, and her mother was always threatening to hurt her, the impossible had happened. She waited until nightfall, when the barn was dark and the only sounds were the chirping of bugs outside. She saw Elijah fixing a piece of equipment near the back wall. Her heart raced against her ribs, each beat a drumbeat of doom. "Elijah," she said in a shaky voice. He turned, and the darkness made it hard to see his face. There was no need for her to say more. He could see the fear in her eyes. "I am with child," she said, and the words felt like a death sentence as they came out. "Your kid." The silence that came after was complete, heavier than a sack of grain and more oppressive than the heat of summer. Her fear was now reflected in his eyes, bigger and more intense than it had been before. They both knew what would happen if they were found out. Death. There was no trial, and there was no mercy for a slave who touched a white woman, especially the daughter of a powerful planter. The sentence for Elijah would be quick and harsh, the rope, or maybe something even worse. People would think that Thomas and Isaac were involved. so their fate would probably be the same. They would be sold to the sugar fields of Louisiana, which many people thought was worse than death. And for Catherine, her future was probably the most uncertain and, in some ways, the scariest. She would not be put to death. Instead, she would have to live as a permanent, walking warning story, a disgraced woman whose child was taken from her and whose life was a warning about what happens when you don't obey. The secret she now had was more than just a life. It was a ticking bomb, and every day that went by, the fuse got shorter. Thomas, the quiet scholar, began to look for a weapon as Catherine's fear threatened to take over her. He knew that using brute force against the Kellerman power structure wouldn't work. The only thing that could save them was finding a secret, a flaw in Margaret's armor. He started a secret and very risky investigation using his occasional access to the Plantation office to sort through papers. He looked through ledgers, delivery manifests, and old letters to find anything that seemed strange. What he found scared him to death. Tucked away in a hidden ledger detailing household medical expenses were 4 names, 4 girls, daughters of prominent local families, all of whom had been noted as receiving extended restorative care at the Kellerman estate in the 2 years prior to Catherine's own imprisonment. Next to each name was a last, terrifying entry. The note said, disposed of, natural causes for 2 of them and resolved for the other 2. The pattern was clear. Catherine wasn't the first. She was just the most recent victim. Margaret Kellerman wasn't just a dictator. She was also a serial killer who used her barn as a private execution chamber. When Thomas told Catherine about what he had found, she suddenly remembered something. Her father in his locked study, which Margaret had sealed after his death and told everyone not to enter, and a small fancy key that had been hidden years ago in the false bottom of her mother's music box. This was a secret between a father and daughter. What if the key was still there? Catherine pretended to pass out from exhaustion that night while Margaret was hosting guests. In the chaos that followed, she was taken back to the main house and kept in her room for a while. It was the opportunity she needed. She snuck out of her room and found the music box. The key was inside. She hurried to her father's study with her heart racing. The lock made a rusty click as it turned. The room looked just like it did when he left it, covered in dust and a mausoleum of a better time. She found it inside his desk, under a pile of farming magazines, a locked metal box. There was almost $200 in cash inside, which was a lot of money. There were letters that showed her father was secretly writing to abolitionist groups in Philadelphia. They talked about his plan to start the process of freeing every enslaved person on the plantation when he turned 50. And then there was the most damning document of all, his real, unexecuted will, which gave a large part of his estate directly to his most trusted enslaved workers, such as Elijah and Thomas, when they were freed. There was another letter in the will, this one written by her father and sent to his lawyer. It wasn't a note from a man who was dying from a fever. It was a suicide note in which he admitted that he was too weak to stop his wife's cruel behavior. He had killed himself, something Margaret had skillfully hidden to protect the family name and take over the estate. Catherine now had proof of her mother's lies, her father's true legacy, and maybe even the tools they needed to get away. They had no more than 24 hours. Margaret had become suspicious of Catherine's ongoing illness and had asked Dr. Harrison to come the next afternoon to check on her. Their fates would be sealed once the doctor confirmed that she was pregnant. They came up with the plan in the middle of the night out of pure desperation. It was a frantic, whispered meeting in the dark corner of the barn. It was a long shot, an impossible bet, but it was the only one they had. Catherine would pretend to be a young widow, Mrs. Catherine Kellerman, and travel north after her husband's sudden death with the money her father had left her. She would wear clothes that belonged to her mother that she had borrowed. Elijah, Thomas, and Isaac would be her property, and she would take them to Savannah to sell them. The story was believable enough to pass a quick look, but it all depended on how good their forged papers were. Thomas knew a disgraced clerk who lived near the docks in Savannah. He was good at forgery and wanted money. It was a risky link, but it was their only chance. They would need travel papers, bills of sale, and papers showing that they were free to go north. Thomas said, "He'll ask for $50. And his face was grim. They had already lost a quarter of their escape money before they even started. There was no other choice. Isaac was the part of the plan that broke my heart the most. The boy, who was small for his age, couldn't convincingly pretend to be a man being taken to the docks to be sold. He would have to stay behind. His job was very important and very brave. He would wait until morning, then run to the overseer and say that Catherine had threatened him with a knife, overpowered him, and fled alone during the night. The story would lead the search party the wrong way, toward the inland roads, giving the others valuable time to get to the coast. It was a lie that would get him in a lot of trouble, like a whipping that could hurt or kill a boy his size. Isaac looked at Catherine with an unnerving level of maturity when she cried and begged him not to do it. "Let them whip me," he said in a calm voice. "Let them think I'm a coward who was scared of a girl. It's better than what they'll do to you, to all of you." In his eyes there was no fear, only a heartbreaking, resolute purpose. The plan was in place. The stakes were very high. Thomas slipped away from the plantation as the sun began to set and cast long, scary shadows over the cotton fields. After dark, it was dangerous for a black man to make the 8-mile trip to Savannah. Every sound in the woods could be a patrol, and every barking dog in the distance could mean that someone has been found. The slave patrols were called the Paddy Rollers, and they were known for being very violent. If an enslaved person was caught without a pass, they were thought to be a runaway and were punished right away and brutally. Catherine, Elijah, and Isaac waited in a heavy, stifling silence back in the barn. Every minute felt like it would last forever. Every creak of the old barn and every hoot of an owl made their hearts race. Catherine had gotten a set of her mother's black mourning clothes and a travel cloak back, and hidden them in a grain sack. She had the $50 safely hidden in her chemise. They had to wait and pray that Thomas hadn't been caught. A shadow broke away from the darkness near the barn door just before midnight. Thomas was it. He was back, alive and empty-handed, and his face showed how tired he was. He had the papers. He had found the forger, a nervous, sweaty man who worked in a dirty back room of a dockside tavern by candlelight. The papers were very well done. They were travel documents for Mrs. Catherine Kellerman, a widow, and official bills of transfer for 3 enslaved men who were being moved to pay off an estate. The price was exactly $50, down to the last penny. They left at 2 a.m., moving through the sleeping plantation like ghosts. Isaac took them on a secret path through the woods that didn't go by the main road or the overseer's house. He stopped at the edge of the property. There were no dramatic farewells, only a quiet, desperate embrace between the boy and the 2 men who had become his brothers, a final, tearful look from Catherine, a silent promise to a boy who was sacrificing himself for their freedom. After that, they were on their own, walking the last few miles to Savannah. The trip was a nightmare of stops and starts. When they heard horses coming, they dove into ditches and hid in thickets of brush, their hearts racing. Catherine, unused to such exertion, struggled to keep pace, her body aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she kept going, driven by a deep mix of fear and love, fear of her mother and a fierce, protective love for the unborn child and the man walking next to her. They weren't just running away anymore, they were a family fighting for their first breath of freedom. They reached the waterfront of Savannah as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern sky, turning the harbor into a silhouette of tall masts and sleeping ships. The air was thick with the smell of salt, tar, and fish. The city was beginning to stir, the sounds of wagon wheels on cobblestone and merchants shouting their wares echoing through the morning mist. Finding a secluded alley, Catherine changed into the morning clothes. She used water from a public pump to wash her face and hands, which helped her shape her features and channel the arrogant confidence she had always hated in her mother. To get away from her, she had to become Margaret Kellerman. When she emerged, she was no longer the frightened girl from the barn. She was a grieving widow, her expression a mask of dignified sorrow. They walked to the steamboat office, with Elijah and Thomas a few steps behind her, their heads bowed as if they were bowing to her. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the ticket clerk, a balding man with tired eyes. She presented the forged documents with a steady hand. The clerk looked over the papers very carefully, scanning the script, the signatures, and the stamps that looked official. He squinted as he held them up to the light. The quiet in the small office was so loud. Catherine could feel the sweat running down her back. The clerk stamped the papers with a loud thud that sounded like a gunshot after what felt like a lifetime. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said in a flat voice. "Passage for 1 and cargo transport for 3 on the Morning Star, leaving at 9 o'clock. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Kellerman." She felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over her. They had done it. They had gotten through. In 3 hours, they would be on a boat heading north, away from Georgia, away from Margaret, and toward a new life. They found a quiet place on the busy dock to wait, where they could blend in. But as the sun rose higher and shone all over the busy port, Thomas's body stiffened. He shook his head slightly, almost not at all. "Don't look now," he said in a voice that was tight with fear. "To the left, by the warehouse. A man in a brown coat. He's been watching us since we left the ticket office." Catherine took a chance and looked to the side. The man looked rough and had a hard, calculating face. He wasn't trying to be sneaky. He was watching them with a creepy, predatory interest. When their eyes met for a split second, the man turned and quickly walked up the street towards the main part of town. "Slave catcher," Thomas said the word, and it sounded like death. Their fragile hope, which was so new and bright, was already starting to fade. The 3 hours of waiting were the worst pain imaginable. Every minute that went by felt like a noose getting tighter. As soon as they could, they got on the Morning Star and went to the small, private cabin that Catherine's ticket gave them access to. But there was no way to be safe. The ship was a prison that floated. They could only sit, listen, and wait for what they knew would happen. At 7 o'clock, the noise they had been dreading broke out on the dock. Loud voices and the sound of heavy boots hitting the gangplank. Catherine looked through the small window in the cabin. Her mother was there. The county sheriff and 2 armed deputies were with Margaret Kellerman when she got there. She moved like a queen whose kingdom had been defied, her face a mask of cold, controlled rage. The ship's captain didn't fight back because he was scared of the law and one of the county's most powerful people. Margaret stormed through the ship, looking at every face. There was no knock on the cabin door before it burst open. Margaret stood there, looking at Catherine's morning clothes and then at Elijah and Thomas, who were being held at gunpoint in the hallway behind her. "Did you really believe?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Did you really think you could get away from me for even a second?" But the fear that had been with Catherine her whole life was gone. It had burned away and been replaced by a white-hot, freeing rage. She stood up straight, chin up, and looked her mother in the eye without flinching. "I found Father's will," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I found his letters. I know what you did to him, and I know you lied." Catherine saw a flash of something in her mother's eyes for the first time. It wasn't guilt, it was more like annoyance, as if something small had gone wrong. Margaret's confession was just as scary as what she did. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "Your father was weak. He would have ruined this family with his sentimental ideas. I did what I had to do to protect our name, and I will do what I have to do now." She moved closer, and her eyes fell to Catherine's stomach. "You are a bigger fool than I thought. Dr. Harrison looked at your room yesterday morning after you ran away. He found proof of your condition." She enjoyed saying the word, turning it into a weapon. "You have not only brought shame on this family, you have also tainted its blood. The punishment for that will be severe for all of you." Thomas Reed spoke as the sheriff stepped forward with handcuffs in hand, ready to arrest them. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension in the small cabin like a knife. "It's too late," he said with shocking, unshakable certainty. Margaret looked at him with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What did you say, slave?" "I said, it's too late," Thomas said again, looking her in the eye without any fear. "We sent copies of the will and your husband's letters to lawyers in Philadelphia, abolitionist groups in Boston, and newspapers in New York. The news of what you do in your barn is already spreading across the North. It was a great, desperate bluff. They hadn't sent anything, but Thomas told the lie with the same confidence that a man with a winning hand would have." A doubt was planted. For the first time, Margaret's perfect calmness wavered. "You are illiterate slaves," she said with anger, but the words didn't have the same power as before. "You can't do that." Thomas smiled, which was a cold, defiant gesture. "On the contrary, Mrs. Kellerman, I can read and write better than most of the white men in this county. And for the past 3 weeks, every time you sent me to your office, I did more than sort your papers. I copied them." He let the words hang in the air, building a fortress of lies around them. "I copied everything. Every fake death certificate for the girls in your barn. Every secret ledger, every letter you wrote to Mrs. Radford and Mrs. Brighton telling them how to get rid of their daughters' bodies. It's all written down, it's all copied, it's all sent north. If you arrest us, you will be putting the witnesses to your own crimes on the stand. The truth is already out of your control." The bluff was very clever, but it could only last so long against the combined power of Margaret's influence and the county sheriff's power. They were chained up and dragged off the ship, where dock workers and sailors stopped to watch the runaway slaves and their disgraced mistress fall. The county jail, a small, dark building made of brick and iron, was where they were taken. Catherine was taken away from the others and put in a small private cell on the upper floor. It was a room just for white women. It had a bed, a bucket, and one barred window that looked out over the town square. Elijah and Thomas were thrown into the lower level, a dark, smelly space called the slave pen. This is where enslaved prisoners were kept before being sold or punished. Few people came out of there unbroken. Margaret went to Catherine's cell that night. She didn't bring any comfort or motherly love. Her visit was a harsh, cold judgment. "You have cost me a lot of trouble and money," she said, as if talking about a bad business deal. "But it will be fixed." She told them exactly what would happen to them in the future. The sheriff would have gotten full confessions from the men by morning. By the end of the week, Elijah would be put to death. Because he was rude and could read and write, Thomas would be sold to a work camp in the swamps of Louisiana, and Catherine would be sent back to the barn, where she would stay until her unfortunate condition resolved itself, which meant that she would have to have an abortion with the help of the willing Dr. Harrison. 3 days went by in a silent, painful hell. Catherine didn't hear anything or see anyone but a jailer who brought her small meals. A small stone hit her window on the 4th day. She ran to the bars. Isaac was down below, hidden in the alley's shadows. He was there, even though his face was covered in bruises and his lip was split. He had made it through his punishment. He climbed up a rainpipe quickly, his small body quick, until he was hanging onto the bars of her window. The news he brought was terrible. He whispered, "Elijah is gone," his voice full of grief and pain. "They took him 2 nights ago and said he was being moved to a state facility, but one of the guards told me they took him out to the swamp. He's not coming back." He stopped and took a deep breath. They worked on Thomas for 2 days. He's still alive, but barely. He didn't tell them anything. The hope that Thomas's bluff had sparked was gone. They had not succeeded. Elijah was dead, and they were running out of time. Isaac reached through the bars and took Catherine's hand as she began to cry. Her body shook with grief so deep it felt like it would tear her apart. "No," he said with a strong sense of urgency. "Don't give up, not now. Thomas lied when he said he sent all the papers, but he didn't lie when he said he sent everything." Isaac said through his own tears, "Weeks ago, long before the escape plan was even a whisper, Thomas was sure that Margaret was killing girls in the barn. He had done the impossible with his valuable knowledge and a contact in Savannah. He hadn't sent copies of all the documents. That was a lie. But he had written and sent one long letter, a letter to a well-known abolitionist in Pennsylvania. He told them everything," Isaac said, his eyes begging her to understand. "He wrote about the barns, not just ours, but also the others he thought were missing. He named the girls he knew were missing and your mother. He signed it from an anonymous source in Georgia, hoping they would believe him." Catherine's heart, which she thought was beyond repair, suddenly filled with a desperate, scary hope. One letter from a slave? Would anyone even care to read it? Would anyone believe it? It was a weak shield against Margaret Kellerman's power. "You have to stay alive until they get here," Isaac said, holding her hand tightly. "People will say that Thomas and I are just lying slaves with a grudge. But you, Catherine, are her daughter. You're the one witness they can't ignore. You have to live, Catherine. You have to live to testify." With Isaac's desperate confession in hand, Catherine came up with a new plan to stay alive. She started to act like the broken daughter her mother had always wanted her to be. Catherine was calm, crying, and full of guilt when Margaret came to see her again. She begged for forgiveness and promised to do what her mother asked. She made Margaret believe that her spirit had finally been broken. Margaret was so sure she had won that she canceled the deal with Dr. Harrison and had Catherine let go from jail. But they didn't let her go. They took her back to the Kellerman mansion and locked her in a guest room on the 3rd floor. The door was locked from the outside. She was stuck in her own house, and the silence that filled her days was scary and watchful. Dr. Harrison started coming once a week. His exams were clinical and not personal. He never said he wanted to end the pregnancy, but his careful notes and measurements made it clear what he was planning. He was keeping an eye on the health of the child he fully planned to take from her as soon as it was born. Weeks turned into months. October came after September. Catherine's body changed, and it became harder to deny that she was pregnant. Every day that went by, hope faded. The letter seemed like a prayer from a dying man. Everything changed one afternoon in late October. There was a loud noise coming from downstairs. She could hear her mother's voice, which was sharp and commanding, but there was also a hint of panic in it that she didn't recognize. Then she heard the sound of deep, unfamiliar male voices that were strong and commanding. An hour later, someone unlocked her door. Her mother was standing there, her face pale and her composure broken. "Get dressed," she said in a strained whisper. "We're going to the courthouse. Don't say anything." They quickly put Catherine in a carriage and took her to Savannah. 2 men were waiting in a dusty office with wood paneling at the county courthouse. They wore dark suits that were very serious, and their northern accents cut through the thick southern air. They said they were from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and were looking into things. Mrs. Kellerman has been very helpful in clearing up the unfortunate misunderstandings that have happened, one of the men said, his voice dripping with doubt that was almost an accusation. He looked at Catherine with a piercing gaze. "We have come to look into some claims made in a letter we got about the safety of some young women in this county. We need more witnesses." Catherine Kellerman told them everything in the sterile, quiet room of the courthouse. Her mother and her mother's lawyer watched in silence. A flood of truth that had been held back for too long came out of her mouth. She talked about the barn and the hard, pointless work. She talked about her mother's doctor's visits, the measuring tape, and the cold entries in her diary. She named the other girls, Charlotte Brighton, Emily Radford, and Victoria Ashford. They were young women who had gone missing after going through the same kinds of things. She told them about her father's real will, his secret wish to free his slaves, and the suicide note that her mother had hidden. The investigators wrote down every detail very carefully, and their faces got darker with every new piece of information. They called Thomas, who was taken from the infirmary of the county jail. He was a shadow of his former self, thin and weak, but his mind was sharp and his voice, though weak, was steady. He confirmed every part of Catherine's story and added his own thoughts on the ledgers, the forgeries, and how Margaret's methods were slowly spreading to other plantations. Next came Isaac, whose testimony confirmed the pattern of girls going missing and barns being empty that he had seen on his trips between estates. Catherine's voice broke with fresh grief as she told them about her pregnancy, Elijah Morrison, and how he had been taken from jail and killed without a trial, without a charge, and without even a piece of paper to mark his death. This was the last, most devastating blow. At this point, one of the investigators pulled out a piece of paper, a copy of the letter Thomas had sent. He started to read from it, and his voice filled the quiet room. It was a voice from the grave that revealed a conspiracy of the living. As more and more evidence came in, a clear, documented fortress of truth, Margaret Kellerman's calm finally broke down for good. The empire of cruelty she had built, which was held together by silence, power, and the complicity of her peers, was finally facing the one thing it could not stand: being exposed. The trial of Margaret Kellerman became the most scandalous and closely watched legal proceeding in Georgia's history. It showed how bad things really were in plantation society, even though it looked nice on the outside. Every day, the courthouse was full of people who were morbidly interested in the gruesome details of the treatment barns. Catherine's testimony was the most important part of the prosecution. She talked for 2 days without stopping, and her story was so detailed and horrifying that the courtroom was silent. The other plantation families involved in the network rushed to protect themselves. The Radfords and Brightons left the state overnight, leaving their estates in the hands of overseers. Others, like the Ashfords, destroyed evidence and said they didn't know anything, making Margaret look like a unique, horrible monster who had tricked them. The unspoken agreement that had kept them safe for so long had broken down, and now each family was desperate to save itself. Margaret's case was weak. Her lawyers tried to make Catherine look like a crazy, angry daughter, and Thomas and Isaac look like slaves who were lying to get their freedom. But the proof was too strong. Finding her father's real will, the financial records that showed large, unexplained payments to Dr. Harrison, and Margaret's own diary, which was found in her study, sealed her fate. The jury gave its verdict in January 1844. 7 counts of murder, as well as many counts of forgery and property theft related to her illegal seizure of her husband's estate, led to Margaret Kellerman's conviction. She got a life sentence in prison. The woman who was obsessed with her name and her place in society lost both. 2 years later, she died in a state prison from a fever that was similar to the one she had made up for her husband. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds, and her name was permanently removed from the society pages she had once ruled. But the punishment that was given to Margaret could not bring back the lives she had so cruelly taken. As part of the legal process to break up Margaret's estate in the spring of 1844, the eastern barn was ordered to be torn down. It was a dark monument to the Kellerman name that was so terrible that no one wanted it to stay standing. When the workers started to pull up the floorboards and dig into the hard-packed earth of the building's foundation, they found what everyone had been afraid of. They found a mass grave under the barn, with the bodies of 7 people buried in shallow, unmarked plots. 7 young women whose bones showed that their treatments had failed. 7 daughters who had been worked and starved to death on purpose, and their bodies were thrown away like trash. 7 girls whose families chose to believe a convenient lie instead of the uncomfortable truth about their daughters' murders. Catherine, who was now the legal heir to her father's real estate, made sure that each girl was buried properly in the churchyard nearby. She had headstones made for each of them, giving them back their names that had been lost in the grave. Finally, their names were written down and their stories were told. Emily Radford was the reader. Charlotte Brighton was the aspiring scholar. Victoria Ashford was the secret teacher, and 4 others whose disappearances had been so quietly handled that only their killers remembered them. Margaret Thornton, Abigail Henderson, Sarah Whitmore, and Eleanor Pueit. They had tried to hide the horrible truth deep in the Georgia soil, but now it was out in the open. Catherine had a healthy baby boy in February 1844, just a few weeks after her mother was found guilty. She gave him the name William Elijah Kellerman to honor both the kind father she had lost and the brave man she had loved. Catherine's purpose became very clear when she gave birth to her son. She wasn't just a survivor of a terrible event, she was also the start of something new. She got the whole Kellerman plantation because she used her father's legal and moral will, which had been probated. As the new head of the estate, her first act was revolutionary. She started the process of manumission, which meant freeing every single enslaved person on the property. It was an act that shocked the whole county and made her neighbors angry, but she didn't care what they thought. She had seen the real side of their society and didn't want to be a part of it. Thomas Reed lived through the terrible injuries. He got his strength back, and when he was legally free, Catherine offered him a paid job as the estate manager. She trusted his sharp mind and strong moral compass to help her through this new phase of her life. Isaac, who was now a free young man, also chose to stay. Catherine made sure that he got the formal education he had always been denied, and he grew up to be a smart and kind young man. The survivor, the scholar, and the witness made the impossible happen when they worked together. Once known for suffering and death, the Kellerman Plantation is now a Georgia plantation that doesn't use any slave labor and is run by the people who used to be considered property. It was a radical experiment, a light of hope in a dark and violent system, and it became Catherine's true and lasting legacy. The full, horrible story of how Margaret Kellerman's treatment barns were run was kept secret for decades in the county courthouse's dusty, neglected archives. It was a shameful event in the area, so bad that the powerful families who were involved worked hard to make sure it was forgotten. They changed the stories about their families, making their murdered daughters out to be tragic victims of consumption or unlucky people who had chosen to live alone. The conspiracy of silence was broken at trial, but it was carefully put back together in the pages of history. But documents that are sealed, like bodies that are buried, have a way of coming to light. A historian looking into Southern culture before the Civil War bought a trunk with a false bottom at an estate sale in 1923, almost 80 years after the trial. Margaret Kellerman's lawyer used to own the trunk. Inside the false bottom was the one piece of evidence that had never been made public: Margaret's original, uncensored diary. What it said was much more disturbing than the fact that one horrible woman was cruel. It had copies of her letters to other matriarchs, not just in Georgia, but also in 3 other states. It was a detailed, scary record of a network of mothers sharing tips on how to get their kids to do what they wanted, comparing methods for getting them to take laudanum to make them do what they wanted, and sharing ways to get rid of failed treatments without anyone knowing. Margaret Kellerman hadn't been an inventor. She had been a perfecter of a widespread secret practice. The unanswered question that still haunts us is a scary one. How many other secret barns were there? How many other daughters just disappeared? Their stories didn't end in a European finishing school. They ended in a shallow, unmarked grave. It looks like some secrets are still hidden. The story of Catherine Kellerman and the hidden barn shows that the scariest things are not always supernatural. They are people. They come from an obsession with looks, from valuing a life that is seen as flawed, and from the quiet, systemic protection of cruelty when it looks respectable. Margaret Kellerman was not an anomaly. She came from a society that cared more about following the rules than about people.